Welcome to Tales from the Bridge. This is episode 92, and today we have Joe Haldeman on the show. If you haven't checked out any of his work, definitely do so. Look in the show notes of this episode. We'll have some links to his blog and other works. Sam, Kevin, and myself have a great chat with Joe here. He's got many stories to tell, and we're very, very happy to have him on the show today. Well, let's make our way over to the bridge. Named a Grand Master of Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America, Joe Haldeman has earned steady awards over his 54-year career. His novels The Forever War and Forever Peace both made clean sweeps of the Hugo and Nebula Awards, and he has won 3 more Hugos and 3 more Nebulas for other novels and shorter works. 3 times he's won the Risling Award for Best Sci-Fi Poem of the Year. He won the World Fantasy Award for the short story in 1993, Graves. In 2012, he was inducted into the Science Fiction Hall of Fame. His latest novels are a trilogy, Mars-Bound, Star-Bound, and Earth-Bound, and a standalone, Work Done for Hire. The graphic novels of The Forever War and Forever Peace are out from Titan Books. Joe was a combat soldier in Vietnam, which strongly influenced some of his work. The movie rights for The Forever War have been sold to Warner. And when Joe's not writing or teaching, he's retired from MIT where he taught every fall semester for 30 years. He paints, bicycles, plays the guitar, and spends as much of his time as he can under the stars as an amateur astronomer. He's been married to Mary Gay Potter Haldeman for 58 years. Joe, welcome to the bridge.
Always glad to be either here or there.
Anywhere.
Actually, we're always glad to visit Canada, even in this cybernetic way.
Yeah.
One of my favorite countries. Not counting, Tunisia.
Do you come up often or every once in a while? Because often it's us that comes down to you in the winter.
Yeah, well, I guess I would have to say, looking back over the past 50-some years, we more often go up there. I suppose there's been 4 or 5 times we actually went up for science fiction conventions, World Cons, North America. Oh, if you hear a noise, that's Gay calling the cat who's investigating my fountain pens. And no, she's not supposed to play with them. She doesn't even speak English, actually. But...
The cat? The cat doesn't speak English?
No, really, she doesn't obey English, I should say. But...
Didn't realize.
Yeah,
well, you can't be a science fiction author without a cat. At least I'm pretty sure you can't.
I was going to say, our listeners know that there's always a cat on the show. If there's an author on the show, there's a cat on the show.
Probably true, yeah.
Well, I want to start off with something a little bit fun. When you started writing in the 70s, many new authors were coming in and writing a new kind of science fiction. And this was the tail end of a lot of the classic sci-fi authors being around still. And I just want to know if you could tell us a little bit about meeting one of your favorite authors and how did they feel about your work, and can you tell us a little bit about meeting an author that we would love to hear about?
Well, I guess the big one would be Robert Heinlein. We met Robert and Virginia Heinlein after having read his stuff for all my life. And this was funny because just today I came across an aerial photograph of the place where the Heinleins and we had lunch, the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami Beach. We were coming down to Miami for a strange little science fiction get-together, which was a writing workshop, but also a sort of a living workshop, kind of an odd thing where we got an island called Pigeon Key, a little island in the Florida Keys, and we rented the whole thing and just sat down there for a week and ate and drank and went out on rowboats, and I guess we actually had a motorboat too, but didn't use it too often, and just had a wonderful tropical time. We go by there every time we go down to the Keys, because you must. I mean, it's a one-way road, and I always have good feelings about that. Pigeon Key is a wonderful little place, and Heinlein was my favorite writer when I was a kid. Although we have profound political differences, we've never argued over them, and we just sort of allow each other to be himself. And I would describe our relationship when he was alive as quite cordial. I don't know, we had odd little things in common, like fencing. He was a soldier, sort of, and I was a soldier, sort of. Neither of us made a living as soldier. although he was an officer and I never was. Heinlein was an admiral. I guess he finally was made admiral before he died. But he was had a commission during World War II and could not pass the physical. His eyesight was bad. So he was never in an actual active duty officer. And my lack of achievement in military matters was more like, no, I'm not that kind of guy. And that's one thing that Robert and I quite disagreed on. But when you're friends, you just draw those lines and don't really talk very much about the things you'll never come to an agreement with.
If you're thinking about kind of that time when Forever Wars was coming out and post-Vietnam War, military science fiction writing shifted. You and others helped to sort of de-glamorize some of the war or war literature. Can you talk a bit about that shift? Like, did you see that shift? Was it perceivable? Has it changed back over time?
Well, it sort of phases in and out, and the emphasis changes in resonance with cultural factors which are independent of science fiction, of course, I should say. But after I'd had one or two novels out, there was, I think it was Jerry Purnell and a few other right-wing science fiction writers, sponsored a page in Galaxy magazine, which listed the science fiction writers on the left and the ones on the right. And I don't recall whether I gave my permission to be on that list, but I suspect I did. And it was, actually, since I know most of the science fiction writers, and so does everybody else, I could have made that list up myself because I know who's on the right and who's on the left. Most of my good friends are on the left, but not all of them. I think this is a generalization you can make about writers, not just science fiction writers, not just people of my generation. But you got to be loose. You've got to accept friends from whatever, camp, philosophy, religion, politics. And if you don't do that, you become an apologist for your prejudices. And that's something that you see all the time. And, there are writers who I stop reading slowly, sometimes regretfully, because they're assholes. And what can you say about an asshole? I don't want to keep reading his stuff, or hers for that matter. But yeah, that's the way it goes.
And I think you're kind of uniquely positioned to be able to make those types of judgments because you were also the president of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers Association for a couple terms, right?
Yeah.
How did you manage that with? I presume there'd be a lot of politics there.
Some of it might be politics, but a lot of it is being politic as an adjective. I mean, you have to get along with all kinds of people. When I was in charge of the Science Fiction Writers of America, in charge in a most weak sense, I suppose we had a couple of hundred members, up to 800 at the very top. Now there are thousands. They're coming in the windows every place. There's a science fiction writer on every block. Well, it didn't used to be that way, by cracky. When I was a kid, you could hardly find a science fiction writer if you needed to, kill one and stuff him. What are you going to do? I think Gordon R. Dixon said, science fiction writers should live as far away from each other as possible and get together as often as possible. And that sort of says it in a capsule. That's about the way that we lived socially through the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, I don't know, 90s, half a century. And it's basically most of your really close friends are other writers and artists. And the interesting thing, I think, is that most writers and most artists would say writers and artists because we just hung together as a loose affiliation. The writers know about the artists and their problems, and the artists know about the writers and their problems. And believe me, we can take over a hotel.
One thing we talk about a lot on this channel is this sort of evolution that has happened in sci-fi from the time in which you were writing in the 70s and this sort of generational shift through the 80s and 90s. And certainly it feels like there's been
an explosion. Like you say, they're coming in through the windows and everywhere, right? Like, in the last couple of years, what shifted? What brought more people into sci-fi, do you think, in recent time?
That's a very good question. Let me give you a many-faceted answer, or at least a two-faceted answer. For one thing, there are so many more people in the science fiction universe. Ask yourself why. Well, the market has a lot more money associated with it and a lot more opportunities to show off your talents. And it's a broader thing. When I started, 1969 was when my first story came out. Even then, there was a so-called new wave, which was modernist fiction applied to science fiction and fantasy. You didn't have so many Bat Durston kind of heroes in space helmets and fighting off the nasty aliens, that sort of thing. And there was more political and philosophical science fiction. So that was actually the start of a rather large revolution, which I rode like a surfer, It's just the way it is. I didn't study it and respond to what I saw as being philosophical or even financial motivations. But it was there, and I was reading the stuff, and I thought, well, that's interesting. I'd do that. When I started writing really for real money, which would be the mid-1970s, I was also broadening my own education, and I went into graduate school, and I was writing mainstream as well as science fiction. I'm writing a lot of poetry, still do, and my poetry is almost unknown outside of within the science fiction field, and also quite unknown within the poetry field because I'm not that famous or good. But I'm quite willing to pick up a pen and scribble a line or two here.
Is there is there a trend in modern sci-fi that you're enjoying at the moment?
I'm not that cognizant of it. There's a new kind of literacy, a different kind of science fiction, which I'm comfortable with. I'm very comfortable with. And so are the upper echelons of publishing and academia, which is odd. But I don't expect it to last, The people who really make money in publishing and so forth may go back and say, you remember back in the early days of the century, the early days of the decade, when science fiction about big fishes and, oh God, what all was it, I don't know, but they had big fishes. And I say, oh, gray nailer. Yeah, they're big fishes. I mean, they're not just big, they're mean. And they were definitely fishes. Octopi, yes, octopi.
And you're referring to The Mountain in the Sea, I believe.
Yes, The Mountain is.
Right. I've heard of it. I've not checked it out, but that's on the to-be-read list now.
Oh, definitely. It should, I guess, not because it's it is a great novel. I mean, it is a really skillful piece of work. But also to me, it seems like a turning point in the acceptability of serious science fiction, which comes and goes. We were up in Las Vegas. Yeah, we went to see The Sphere, which incorporates all kinds of science fictional cliches and motifs and so forth, without giving us any credit at all. It's just they got there from Hollywood.
Did you think about that in The Sphere as a science fiction experience? Imagine that from back in the 1960s. Was that an otherworldly thing? Was it science fiction coming to reality?
In some specific and small ways.
Okay.
I mean, the thing itself is just a big, wonderful piece of gonzo technology out of control. But in terms of the expression of artistic taste and especially restraint, it's very much like a 1950s science fiction magazine. Like, all the people who are consuming this are dumb fucks, but we're going to give them exactly what they want because we have them figured out.
Well, it is located in Las Vegas, Joe. So
yeah, Vegas. So what do you expect?
Right.
So, Joe, you're a scientist. How do you feel about, we have been talking a little bit about science fiction becoming more real the further we go into the future. How do you feel about the events of the last few years?
Well, I wish things had happened faster. for the past, say, 30 years, I've been rather disappointed in the slow advance of science, and specifically the space program. But on the other hand, I've got to say, that's only because my own perception is warped by the era that I was born into. When I was just starting, when I was drafted in 1968, the space program was taking off, and space science was getting all kinds of money, and it was being funded, obviously, in concert with the military establishment and the explosive growth in militarism with the Vietnam War and the great communist menace that we have responded to so adroitly. I don't think of myself in broad historic terms or my life as as some sort of a signifier of political or scientific evolution. I'm just kind of a guy who looks up every now and then and says, I thought that was going to happen, and there it did. But most of the time I look up and say, why didn't we figure this out 100 years ago? Why was everybody surprised by this? I've got to say, when the big space program and all that, I was prepared for that by science fiction.
You've got some experience imagining the future, and as a science fiction writer, when you're writing a science fiction, you're not restricted by that scientific conservatism or caution. And I can't help but think of the time dilation premise in Forever War. It's a time travel novel in a way. It's a lot of different types. It's an anti-war novel in a way, and it's a military sci-fi novel in a way, but it's also a time travel novel in a way where your characters are transporting through history, and you're imagining the human evolution. What inspired that? What were some of the risks that you got to take as you got to imagine future humans in a future Earth?
Well, I have to say that it was not an extremely risky thing. The whole Forever War industry, which I have benefited from all my life, comes from a little article in Science magazine back in the mid-'60s. And it's from a Russian investigator who went through the logistics and the financial side of using spaceflight to make communication more efficient, quicker. I'm trying to remember the actual. The article was about a satellite called the Minimum Orbital Unmanned Satellite of the Earth, MOUSE. And MOUSE was basically a radio step-up amplifier, which is in a low Earth orbit. It basically stayed in orbit for weeks or maybe months, but it wasn't a permanent thing. It was the predecessor of a thing called the Echo satellites. Echo was put in a higher orbit and stayed there for a year or two. And it was so bright, it was brighter than Venus at night. So all over the world, people saw this brilliant star. And it didn't do much science at all. It was just up there. And nobody could be unaware of it who ever went out at night. And that was an unscientific thing, but it was just there and it was part of life. And that was really absolutely cool. By that time, I had my own telescope, and I'd go out and look at it. And you could see this bright, unblinking star, which was the Echo satellite. And if under a high enough power, you could see the background stars moving behind it.
Ever wondered what it takes to make it in the movie business? Peel back the curtain with 4-6 Success Filmmaking. 4-6 Success Filmmaking is where filmmakers share their stories and the secrets.
It's beyond competitive out there.
There have been movies that it's taken me 10 years to get made.
Don't wait to create. You've got to just keep making stuff.
Tune in to 4-6 Success Filmmaking for your dose of cinematic realness, direct from the voices that have lived it.
Well, you're not too far from the East Coast and a lot of rocket launches. Do you go down there? Do you watch?
This is why we moved to Florida in the first place.
Really?
100 years ago. Yeah, we came down here to watch the rocket launches on the way to the Apollo program.
Wow.
And I should have established that early on, but that's, we have since lived a couple of other places, but we keep coming back to the land of the rocket launches, because it's the most dramatic thing that happens in our life. And down here, it happens like the weather. You know, I can go out on the street here and watch a rocket launch about once a month, because we can see them if we look just the right angle. We used to go over to the Cape all the time and watch the launches. And that's, say, the first 100 or so. It was pretty remarkable. Now I would not have predicted that by 2020 it would be every day that launches go up. But I should have. I should have seen that. I guess my ability to predict in that regard is affected a little bit by my own history.
Well, you'd also had a lot of, you were saying a lot of disappointments in the slow progress of technology, kind of that "where's my flying car" type scenario.
Right.
But really, I don't think a lot of people expected reusable, landable first and second stage rockets, and so, from that perspective, SpaceX has kind of accelerated things.
Yeah, and that one thing in particular is so off the wall and unpredictable. I mean, who would have thought? We have watched the development of the reusable booster. It was an inch at a time, and an inch at a time, and an inch at a time, and suddenly it was there. I don't know, nothing, I can't think of anything else that was such a precipitous advance, because we watched it. I mean, we were getting up at 4 a.m. to turn on the TV and watch this and that. And then suddenly they're everywhere and they're huge. I mean, if there was money in it, they could be landing people on the moon like once a week.
Well, who knows, right? Like they're talking about trying to land on the moon, have a permanent base there.
Yeah.
Elon Musk and SpaceX wants to have permanent colonies on Mars.
Yeah.
What do you think about that? You think we should be colonizing the solar system?
Well, I wish we were, but it's a complicated question. And you're saying, do you want your dreams to come true, or do you want the dreams of another 6 billion people to come true? I mean, I want us to colonize Mars like yesterday. And in fact, in my own writing, I had it happening a lot sooner than now. But I know that nothing happens independently of all the other factors. And what would we have to give up to have gotten a Mars base by now? I'm not sure, but I think it would have been at least one world war, and maybe more than one. And maybe an awful lot of civilization changing. Maybe an extreme militarization of the United States, to being to make a conservative prediction.
Would you suggest that it might be the resources maybe necessary to do it would be such that it could cause wars? That you think it could be that problematic because it would take so much effort and resources to get there?
Oh, no. I'm much more simplistic than that.
Okay.
I think that money attracts war. When you have that kind of resources all together in one place, in a world full of hungry, ambitious people, a lot of them have uniforms on.
Got it.
And they're not being dishonest or unscrupulous or mean or anything like that. They're just doing what God meant them to do, was get more stars on their shoulder and that sort of thing. I mean, I understand that. My father was a general, and I've been surrounded by military all my life. One reason you don't see a uniform on me now is because I've been surrounded by the military all my life.
And you also said that you may have gone to South America to be in an observatory. If you had done that, do you think you would have been writing a different kind of sci-fi, or do you think you might not have even started to write, or what would have happened?
Boy, I wonder. See, if I had taken that job and if it had protected me from being drafted, I don't know. See, the part of my going down to the Naval Observatory thing in South America would have been the assumption that I would continue my academic career as an astronomer, which would mean, eventually getting my PhD. Not too eventually, or you're a dead man if you don't go fast enough in your academic ambition. So I would have gotten a PhD in astronomy and probably had a good career of publications in academia. I might have written stories, because I wrote my first stories before I was drafted, before I got to that. I suspect that other people have noticed, you can't stop a person from writing. And if a person was born to be a writer, he's probably going to be a writer one way or another. I meet people all the time that have some variation of, I was always going to write a book. And after I retire, I'll write this book because I've been thinking about it for 50 years. And they're quite honest about it. They're not that much different from me. What's different for me is the microcosm of science fiction publishing, because I got rewarded from the very beginning, just in terms of getting a check for writing a story. And that's a huge thing that a lot of people go decades without achieving because they aren't science fiction fans.
Well, we've got to ask about your most recent stuff, and are you working on anything now? And what should we be reading from Joe Haldeman?
All I do nowadays, I blog essentially. I write essays. They're sort of about space, often about space, and they're sometimes about the military. But often they're just about what's happening around me and what do bloggers do. I kind of look at the world around me and keep typing until people stop me or until I get tired. Yeah, my latest novel, which is a few years old, is called Work Done for Hire. And it was a bit of a departure because it's only moderately science fictional, but also has elements of horror and fantasy and this and that. Basically, I either start typing or start scrolling with a fountain pen. It usually coalesces into a book idea pretty quickly. This particular one, I think I started it on a train trip, didn't I? I had a couple of images that were just stuck in my brain. I don't know that they even survived to the final draft, but I had this image, which I guess was a bad dream, which is somebody chopping wood and losing a finger. And, I had this scene of what would you do if you chopped off your own finger and you're in the woods somewhere, you can't just go to a hospital. What do you do? You can't put it back on. And so I typed up this, or rather I wrote with a fountain pen, this gripping kind of set of things, which did not wind up being in the novel. The character, with his finger back on, did wind up being the main character of the novel. But, it's not easy to put a finger back on, but I did. This is one of the things you can do with a typewriter that you can't do with a surgical apparatus. That's a funny thing because it wound up being a weird mix of science fiction and modernist fiction forces coming together. I thought it was quite a successful book, although it's hard for me to remember writing much of it. I was all over the world writing it. I think a list of the places I wrote it was just remarkable. I remember sitting in a bar in France writing it, and I'm writing along, and the sun came up because I was writing it early, and I looked around, and nobody in the whole fucking place spoke English, and my command of other languages is weak, usually limited to food and drink. But as the sun came up, I thought, God, what a life. I mean, this is wonderful. I'm traveling all around the world on basically a nickel a word. Quite happy doing that, and with probably the prospect of doing it for another several years. That was like 20 years ago. And here I am still sort of doing it, or at least at 80 years old. I'm in this kind of traveling on the potential energy that I accumulated by going mv squared over 2 for so many years. I may be not an active writer anymore, but I'm still going through the motions.
But as you say, you've got that wall covered in awards, and you write what you want. You do. I see you're pretty active writing on Facebook, and you're heading off to Glasgow Worldcon, and
yeah,
you're gonna have to speak a foreign language there in Scotland.
Well, depending on who you ask.
I'm just kidding.
No, it's a funny thing because in a very real sense, I'm reaping the rewards of of a life that was fairly active as a writer. And this is a very real kind of reward. If I wasn't doing this, I can imagine being an 80-year-old ex-academic living in some college town, as I do, and just every now and then having a graduate student come up and ask me some dumb question and that sort of thing, and pretending to be an academic. Well, I don't have to pretend to be a writer. All I have to do is see this fountain pen. I just have to fill this up and get a stack of paper, and I'm a writer again. All I have to do is write a few lines, and then I'm doing it. That's real in a very emotional sense. Pushing a pen around is what I've been doing for 50 years. I'm quite happy to do it for whatever reason. I think the mechanical part of the job with a typewriter or a fountain pen are extremely rewarding. And you can't gainsay that, this is why I do it. It's not the books that the publishers make a dime or two off of. It's the stack of paper that I deface with a fountain pen.
You've been talking about so much travel. So the travel has affected your writing, would you say? And is that there's many expressions about travel being the best education. Would you support that? And that's influenced your writing in many ways?
It's an idea that has been behind my writing for most of my career. I remember back in 1970, Keith Laumer introduced me to the writings of Boswell and Johnson. And Boswell was my hero for some years. Just reading about him and Johnson hanging out all around Scotland and England, and just talking about abstractions and politics and literature and this and that and the other thing. My idea of being a grown-up, when I was not yet a grown-up, was the idea of sitting around a coffee house with other people and chatting about very serious matters. And I don't know, that's how I saw grown-ups, sort of Boswell and Johnson, and having an audience who was interested in your mind. Well, I've wound up a sort of a 21st century version of that, I think. But Boswell and Johnson didn't have a big audience when they were being the first Boswell and Johnson. They had a gang of people around them. No technology beyond horse carriages. And they had the biggest audience they could find, which was 20 people in a coffee house around a coffee pot. That's all they need. And we have so much more in a way, and less in a way. It's a more interesting world and a less interesting world. And we are more or less interesting people.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Joe, thank you for being on the show. We really appreciate you. Listeners, we've always got something coming up, and you're here to the very end. We appreciate that more than you know. If you haven't subscribed to the show or you haven't left a review, let us know what you think of the show. Leave a review, subscribe, let us know, tell a friend. We would love to hear from you. Thank you so much. Until next time.